midst of the cold of the trench, the constant sound of explosions in the distance, and the silence that only true loneliness can bring, a young soldier named Konstantin pulled a crumpled paper from his coat pocket. There was no one to write to. There was no address, but there was an urgency within him, almost as if his heart needed to pour out feelings so as not to completely overflow. And it was like that, with trembling hands and tired eyes, that the first letter was born. That night, unlike the others, something drove him. Maybe it was the fear of not seeing the next day. Perhaps it was the desire to hold on to some idea of the future. But what he wrote was neither a plea nor a lament. It was an imaginary dialogue. Soft words, like he was talking to someone who understood him. It started like this: "Honey, I know you don't exist. Or maybe you do, but we haven't met yet. Still, I need to tell you about my day." That letter, addressed to nothing and signed only with the initial K, was carefully folded and placed inside a small wooden box that he kept among his most intimate belongings. It wasn't supposed to be sent. There was no seal, no name, no location. It was just an anchor, an attempt to keep your feet on the ground when everything around you was falling apart. Konstantin was a reserved man. In the company of other soldiers he spoke little, but in the letters he said it all. He revealed fears, confessed dreams, described the smell of the countryside. After the rain, the taste of the light soup served in the fields, the longing for childhood and, above all, the hope of a reunion that had not yet occurred. He wrote as if he expected it, but I didn't know exactly what. It was an unusual habit. While other men wrote to wives, fiancées or mothers, he wrote to a woman he had not yet met. It was as if, little by little, he was creating a bridge between the real and the impossible, and somehow that kept him alive. In the letters, Konstantin idealized this woman as someone capable of understanding him without judging him, someone who would listen silently and respond from the heart. He wrote, "I imagine your eyes are like rest after a hard day. May your voice be like a comforting prayer. I don't know your name, but sometimes I have the feeling that if I said it out loud, it would sound familiar. The war was cruel, carried away by time. It took more than life from us. It took away our faith, our hope, our identity." But in letters he resisted. It was as if, by writing to this unknown woman, he could remember who she was deep down. Writing saved him from invisible death, the one that kills from within. He never told the other soldiers. He guarded the letters with the same zeal as a collector of sacred relics. Sometimes at night I would reread one or two, and he smiles, a brief but true smile. Sometimes I cried. It was like talking to someone who would never leave you. No one quite understood why he never seemed as desperate as the others. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was faith. But the truth was that he had a place to escape to every night. The pages of his letters, the dates passed, the seasons changed, the companions fell, one by one, and Konstantin continued writing, as if that were his only pact with survival, a silent agreement between him and the newspaper. As long as he wrote, he would be alive. But even he couldn't predict what those letters would mean one day. In the last week before the end of the war, the base where he was stationed was hastily evacuated. Amid the avalanche, the smoke, and the deafening sounds of the bombing, the small box was left behind. He only realized it days later, already safe in a temporary camp. Return? No. The war had taught him that there are things that, when lost, must be left behind. But inside him something hurt, as if he had lost the most intimate part of himself. On the other side of history, in the distant future, someone would find that box. And that would be when destiny would truly begin. The story of Konstantin and his letters was not over yet. In fact, it was just getting started. Because sometimes love writes its own pages, and even if we don't know who we write for, perhaps the heart already knows who it is for. There was something deeply human in the way Konstantin held the pen, as if it were the only weapon he had left to keep the most sensitive part of his soul alive. As steady fingers moved over the yellowed paper, the words flowed as if gushing from a long-forgotten spring, held silently among the rubble of fear, loneliness, and cold. The first letter was an outburst, but also an exercise in hope. It was night, and the silence around was so intense that even the sound of graffiti scratching the paper seemed too loud. Outside the war was screaming, but inside that small makeshift tent there was a space of peace, precarious but sincere. And in that space he decided to talk to someone. Not with God, not with the dead, but with a woman he didn't even know, a woman who had no name, face, or address. Just a presence felt deep in the chest. Honey, I know you may never read this, but I need to imagine that you do. I need to believe that there is someone on the other side, someone who feels what I feel, even if they don't know my name. Those words started a journey, the first of many confessions, and each line written was, in fact, an attempt to remain whole in the midst of a reality that tore men apart without making a sound. He spoke of the cold nights, of the sound of the soldiers' boots as they marched, of the glassy eyes of a companion who did not return from the mission. But he also wrote about the dawn, about how the golden light filtered through the gaps in the canvas and reminded him that there was still beauty in the world, even if he was temporarily removed from it. The emptiness that surrounded him was not just geographical, it was existential. And by writing, Konstantin filled this void with words. I wasn't looking for answers, I was looking for connection. And maybe, deep down, I wanted the universe to hear me. As the days passed, the letters stopped being just war reports. They became emotional diaries, filled with deep feelings, childhood memories, and unanswered questions about the meaning of it all. There was something deeply poetic about his writing, even unintentionally, because, by not writing to anyone, he managed to be completely sincere. There was no mask, no censorship, no fear of being judged, he wrote. For example, today I dreamed that we were walking together on a street I don't know. You held my hand and I felt peace. For the first time in a long time, I woke up smiling, and I cried because of it. Anyone reading these words today might think they were the delusions of a man on the brink of the abyss, but not. They were attempts to remember that love, even imagined, was still possible. That there was a part inside him that was untouched by the violence around him. A part that resisted. With each new letter, Konstantin invented details about this unknown woman. Sometimes she said that she liked to read in the afternoons, leaning against the window. Other times, I imagined I was a nurse caring for the wounded, with firm hands and kind eyes. It was a way of projecting humanity into a dehumanized world. He wrote not only to be read, but to give existence to what the war tried to erase: tenderness. As the weeks passed, the number of letters grew. He dated them, but never precisely. There was no longer reliable time in the war, only dawns and dusks that blurred together. And yet, each letter was a testament to his emotional state that day. One card may be serene, another may convey quiet desperation. There were days when he wrote angry, wondering why the world had become so cruel. And there were others in whom the memory of a flower that sprouted among the rubble was enough to rekindle their hope. Today I saw something that made me believe again. A flower, alone, brave, defying everything around me. Like you, maybe. Even without knowing me, I believe that you too bloom where life insists on not being born. That woman, even without existing, became his vanishing point, his emotional anchor, his reason to continue. Konstantin began to write every day, sometimes more than one letter, and he always kept them in the same wooden box, as if he were creating a secret library of feelings that only he and she shared. But the most impressive thing is that the more he wrote, the more he seemed to believe it existed, as if the act of writing not only evoked its presence, but somehow called it into existence. It was as if, by calling her honey, he was invoking destiny to complete the story. These confessions into the void paradoxically filled him more with life, more connected to the purest part of himself. And while the world tried to reduce him to a number among so many soldiers, he became whole through words. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that on the other side of time, one day someone would read all of this, and I would understand. Because true words, even thrown into the void, always find a heart willing to listen to them. The wooden box was small, but it contained more than just paper and ink. It was a reliquary of feelings, of days told with words, and nights rocked by silent confessions. Konstantin protected him as one protects the last fragment of his own identity. Each letter folded, there was a part of himself that he dared not give to the world. But destiny, as always, had its own plans and did not always consult us before carrying them out. The war was approaching its end, although the newspapers did not confirm it. There were rumors among the soldiers, glances were exchanged that spoke more than any official order. The tension in the air was no longer one of fear of combat, but of an announced farewell, not only to the battlefield, but also to that version of himself that only existed. There, one morning, even before the sun had risen, Konstantin was hurriedly awakened. An urgent request. The base was to be evacuated immediately. An unexpected bombardment had destroyed the neighboring camp, and there was an imminent risk of further attacks. In a few minutes, everyone should be ready to go. No luggage, no souvenirs, just what you need to survive. In the midst of the rush, he hesitated. He looked towards the corner of the store where the box was, dirty, worn, but intact. He took a step toward her, but an officer yelled his name and demanded he get into the truck. The choice had to be made, and he left. As the truck rattled along the dirt roads, surrounded by silent soldiers, Konstantin's heart seemed to be left behind, as if a part of him had been forgotten on purpose. And maybe that's how it was. Perhaps keeping the letters there, in the midst of the chaos of war, was a way to free them, or leave them alive at another time. Years passed, decades. The war went down in history. The uniforms were removed, the battlefield silent, the gunshots replaced by the noise of rebuilt cities. Konstantin, now an old man, lived a modest life in a small town. He didn't talk much about what he experienced. He carried a weight in his eyes that others mistook for longing, but which was actually an unspoken memory. And as he quietly aged, that box remained. No one knew exactly how, but she resisted. It was found years later, by chance, among the rubble of an old military warehouse that was going to be demolished. Most of the objects found there were in poor condition: wet documents, torn uniforms, rusty weapons. But the box, made of dark wood, was still closed. As if time had forgiven its content for some inexplicable reason. It ended up in a batch of donations that would be sent to a neighborhood thrift store, one of those places where you can find everything but understand almost nothing. It was there that Clara, a young librarian with a passion for letters and ancient manuscripts, found her. He was looking for old books for a community project when he saw the box. She couldn't explain why she felt so attracted to that object. There was no sign of courage or beauty, but there was something. Maybe the weight, maybe the smell of the wood, maybe an instinct that only those who love stories understand. When he opened the cover, he found more than 100 letters, all handwritten, on yellowed paper, carefully folded. Some had small moisture spots. Others were intact. There were no envelopes. There was no name of the sender. But they all started the same way, honey, and they were all signed with a simple K. Clara spent hours there, sitting on the dusty floor, reading. The first letter made her smile, the second, cry, the third, chilling. And as I immersed myself in those words, I felt something impossible to describe. It was as if those letters had been written to her, as if that pain, that hope, that silent, faceless love had crossed time just to find her. He closed the box with trembling hands. He carried it with him like someone carrying a secret, a mission, and he spent weeks rereading, classifying, studying every detail, trying to discover who this man was who had written to a woman he didn't know, and why he seemed to know her so well. The letters had been forgotten by the world, but not by time. Time, that eternal healer of destinies, simply preserved them until they were ready to fulfill their purpose. Because they are words that do not belong to an era, they belong to a heart. And when they are true, they find a way. In the solitude of her room, Clara leafed through those pages as if she had found a part of herself again. And without knowing it, a new stage in history began. A story where the love that was once thrown into the void finally began to resonate. And in that echo, the letters left behind began to fulfill their destiny. There are meetings that are scheduled in advance, with time, place, and clear intentions, and there are those that destiny hides in its own designs, sewing paths with invisible lines until two worlds touch. Clara was never sure what brought her to that thrift store on that specific day. I could have gone to the store, I could have gone straight home, but she decided to turn the corner, as if something or someone was guiding her. The second-hand store was old, almost imperceptible among the modern buildings that appeared around it. A dusty shop window, books stacked haphazardly, objects piled up on rusty shelves. But for Clara, there was something magical about that chaos. She always believed that certain objects contained stories that were only revealed to those who were willing to listen to them. That morning, I was looking up back issues for a reading project at the public library where I worked. I had already searched through shelves of forgotten novels and readerless encyclopedic collections. As he bent down to reach a box at the back of the store, he saw an object partially covered by a faded blanket, a small wooden box marked by age. When he touched it, he felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. Without thinking, he opened it right there on the floor. And there, before his eyes, were the letters. I didn't know what was more shocking, the number of pages, the precise and emotional writing, or the content that started to spill out of the lines as soon as I started reading. The first letter paralyzed her. It was as if someone was narrating his own feelings, fears he had never said out loud, dreams he thought were only his, words that resonated like echoes of his own soul. He continued reading, right there, for more than an hour. The owner of the second-hand store, a kind and curious lady, approached silently, without interrupting. When Clara finally looked up, they were tearful. "How much does this box cost?" he asked, his voice shaking. The lady looked at her lovingly and replied, "I think this box has already chosen you. Take it. Take good care of it." That's how it all started. In the following days, Clara immersed herself in the letters as if rediscovering the world. Each page seemed constructed with poetic precision. These were not just war reports. They were intimate testimonies of a man faced with the abyss and yet capable of writing about flowers, about hope, about a woman he had never met. "I don't know your name, but I feel like if I said it, it would stay in my mouth like an ancient prayer. You exist in me, even if you never showed up. And maybe that's why I keep writing." Clara felt something impossible to explain. It was not simple admiration, it was connection, as if those words were meant for her, as if they had gone through time waiting for her to find them. The idea seemed absurd, even to someone with an imagination as fertile as his, but he couldn't ignore the feeling. It was like meeting someone you've never met but always loved. The letters had dates but no full names, just the initial K, no direction. There is no visible military identification. Still, Clara began a personal investigation. He visited war archives, consulted records of former veterans, looked for soldiers whose names began with K. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, but she was willing to try. For weeks he alternated his work in the library with visits to museums, archives and associations of ex-combatants. In one of these searches he found a name that caught his attention: Konstantin Sokolov, a naturalized Russian. He had served as a volunteer in an Allied division, never married, prisoner. He has lived in a distant town since the end of the war. There were many coincidences, and the name, although common, sounded like a familiar whisper. With fear and hope, he wrote a letter. He explained that he had found a collection of ancient writings and wanted to confirm that they were his. He didn't mention emotions, just facts. He left the letter in the mail with trembling hands, as if he were sending something of his own, and he waited. Days dragged like centuries, until the answer arrived, in a simple envelope. Some lines: "Yes, the letters are mine. I never thought anyone would find them, much less read them. But now that they've been read, I feel like something has come full circle. If you want to talk, I'll be here." Clara's heart skipped a beat. That night, he didn't sleep, and the following weekend, he left for the small town where he lived, with the wooden box in his lap, as if he were carrying a sacred artifact. She still didn't know what she would find. A man, a ghost from the past, a stranger. But something inside her said, this wouldn't just be a date, it would be a reunion of souls that always looked for each other, even if they didn't know it. Clara arrived at the town as if she were approaching a sanctuary. Small, silent, surrounded by hills and tall trees. The landscape seemed straight out of a forgotten era. He walked through the narrow streets, with the wooden box close to his chest. I wasn't sure what to feel. She was nervous, yes, but more than that. There was a strange sense of belonging within her, as if the path to get there was already laid out long before she was born. Konstantin's house was simple, with windows with faded blue frames and an overgrown garden where wildflowers grew that resisted neglect. He knocked on the door with hesitant hands. Wait, and then, the doorknob turned. He appeared with slow but firm steps. His white hair was well combed, his face wrinkled with age, and a look that, although tired, conveyed an unusual lucidity. When their eyes met, there was silence. Not an empty silence, but a total silence, full of things that no words in the world could translate. He held out the box to her, as if he were returning a lost part of someone's soul. Konstantin looked at it and then at the object. Her eyes filled with tears. "Did you read it?" he asked in a hoarse voice. She nodded slightly. "All of them," he replied. "And in each of them I found myself." He invited her in. The house smelled of old wood and paper. There weren't many photographs on the walls, just landscape paintings. Clara noticed that the place was almost as quiet as he was, but there were books, many books, and a rocking chair by the window. The perfect setting for a man who lived more in the past than in the present. They sat opposite each other, and then began the conversation that would last hours, perhaps entire. Liv, she told how she found the box. She read fragments of letters aloud. Moved, Konstantin listened to her with his eyes fixed on her, as if each of her words were a breath of life. And when she read, he smiled. Smile like someone hearing for the first time what you always wanted to say. Reading the letters was more than a memory, it was a revelation. Clara realized that behind each sentence there was a meaning that perhaps he didn't even know was there. And Konstantin, hearing his own voice through hers, understood for the first time the scope of what she had written. This wasn't just a record of survival, it was a love story written before love existed. At one point Clara paused and said, "Konstantin, how can someone write to a person they don't know? How can they love like that, in the dark?" He thought for a few seconds. Then he replied, "Because sometimes the heart sees before the eyes. And I wasn't writing to just any woman. I was writing to someone who existed somewhere. I just didn't know where or when." This phrase was engraved on Clara like a seal. She didn't know what to say, but at that moment he understood. What he was experiencing was not just the unfolding of an ancient story. It was the beginning of something new, a bond that even late emerged with inexplicable strength, as if the words that once came out of his chest now settled in his heart. In the following days, Clara returned to Konstantin's house. It took them days to read all the letters. Together, explained contexts. He pointed out feelings. They laughed, they cried, they shared silences that said more than any speech. It was as if they had lived together, even though they were separated by time. Reading changed Clara's life, not because it gave her answers, but because it made her feel seen, heard. Favorite, the woman with the cards. Until then, an abstract concept, now took shape within herself. And Konstantin, who once wrote into nothingness, now looked into the eyes of his destiny. Because, in the end, that's what true love is about. Not an immediate presence, but a deep recognition. And when words find those who understand them, they become eternal. Now that you've made it this far, let me make a special request of you. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you think about the power of words, about the connections that span time and space, then reciprocate with a simple but powerful gesture. Leave your like. This helps us enormously to bring stories like this to more hearts that, like Clara's, may be waiting for a message written especially for them. And subscribe to the channel, because there is still a lot to tell. In the next chapter of this exciting journey, you will discover what happens when two lives that have always been apart finally come face to face with the truth. And what Konstantin decides to do will surprise you. Stay with us. The story is just beginning. After that encounter, Clara could no longer live the same way. Something inside her had transformed. It wasn't just the reading of the letters or Konstantin's calm presence that affected her. It was the certainty that she had been placed there, at that exact point in the timeline, for a reason. And now, more than ever, he needed to understand the origin of those words. It was no longer enough to read them. He wanted to know who exactly the man behind the ink was. Although Konstantin had confirmed that he was the author of the letters, there were details that did not add up. Dates that didn't match, memories that were too fragmented, blank periods of time. He didn't seem to be hiding something out of malice, but rather because of a kind of emotional fog that prevented him from remembering everything clearly. After all, war doesn't just leave visible scars. It distorts memories, scrambles faces, embarks on emotions, and archives them in inaccessible places of the mind. Clara then began a new mission, to search for her story, even if Konstantin himself was no longer able to tell it completely. It started with military records. He visited national archives, contacted veterans associations, read war diaries, compared battles and dates. Each clue was like a small piece of an ancient puzzle. An incomplete name here, a blurry photograph there. The name Konstantin Sokolov appeared on scattered lists. Soldiers who had fought in foreign units, volunteers, some missing for long periods, others listed as dead and then found again. The first major discovery came in the form of a forgotten letter in the archives of a deactivated base, a recommendation signed by a senior officer, praising Konstantin's stance during a strategic retreat. It was the first confirmation that he had in fact been on one of the most brutal fronts of the war. Clara spent hours staring at the signature at the bottom of the document, as if she could somehow hear that officer's voice echoing through the paper. But that was not enough. She wanted more. I wanted to know why he started writing. Who did he think he was writing to? What he lost, what he forgot, or decided to forget. Konstantin looked at her tenderly, but without haste. He didn't stop her, but he didn't offer easy answers either. When she asked him, he smiled and said, "Maybe you'll find out more than I remember." This paradox confused and challenged her, because there seemed to be there not only a veil of forgetfulness, but an emotional protection, as if letters had been his only form of emotional survival during the war, and after that, he had simply learned to live without the answers. Clara turned to something she knew well, the language between the lines. As a librarian, I knew that sometimes what is not said is more revealing than the words themselves. And as she reread the letters, now with the eyes of a researcher, she began to notice patterns, repeated phrases, places mentioned delicately, names camouflaged in descriptions. In one of his letters, for example, Konstantin wrote, "Today we march through the valley where the wind blows, like my mother's voice. I remember as a child a song in Russian that she hummed." Clara researched the song and discovered that it was popular in a town in the north of the former Soviet Union. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible, but it offered a new direction. He outlined a new search itinerary, Konstantin's origins before the war. And so he discovered a past that he had never mentioned, a lost brother, a girlfriend who died before boarding, a political escape. Clara realized that the letters were not only about the war, but also about the losses that preceded the fighting. The unknown woman in the letters was perhaps the sum of all the absences in his life, or maybe she was herself, even before they met. The search was not for facts, but for meaning. He started interviewing people. He visited families who lived in the towns indirectly mentioned in the letters. Some remembered a young soldier who wrote all the time, even when there was no paper. Others remembered someone who asked questions about the future, but rarely talked about the past. The image of Konstantin was completed little by little, not as a war hero, but as a survivor of time. A man who, while the world asked for weapons, offered words. And now, at the end of his life, he found these words again, in the voice of a woman who, in some way, had always been searching for him. In the midst of this journey, Clara also discovered herself. He realized that his search was not just for himself, but for something bigger, a meaning, an answer to the nameless emptiness he carried. He discovered that loving someone does not require having him from the beginning, but rather recognizing him when you finally meet him. And that, sometimes, what seems impossible, is just destiny silently preparing the way. Some stories are not fully revealed in the words spoken. They are hidden in the silences, in the glances that avert, in the pauses between one memory and another. And it was exactly in those empty spaces, in these delicate gaps in the narrative, where Clara realized where the keys to the truth were. Konstantin was a man of vivid but selective memory. He spoke with precision of distant events, such as the day he saw snow for the first time on the front, or the moment a bomb fell a few meters from where he was writing a letter. But, curiously, he hesitated when it came to the pre-war era. Every time Clara asked him about his youth, he responded evasively, as if protecting a pain that never healed. With each vague answer, she sensed that there was more there, much more than he was letting on. That's when he decided to listen differently. We no longer question, but observe. Every time I read him a letter, I noticed his reactions. Some words made him smile, others caused discreet tears, but there were expressions that made him remain silent for long minutes, staring into space, as if he were trapped in a time that he couldn't or didn't want to access. That part, I don't remember writing it, he once said, listening to a passage in which he described a woman with brown eyes and steady hands, sewing patches on her coat before winter. But I remember the feeling. It's strange. It's like I met her in a dream. Clara wrote everything down. every silence, every hesitation, and little by little he began to draw the silhouette of a figure absent in Konstantin's life, a real woman. Someone he loved, maybe before the war, maybe only in imagination. But she left such a deep mark that it became the basis for the idealized woman in the letters. A face that dissolved in time, but was never completely erased. She returned to the investigation. In immigration files, he found records of a young woman named Eva Raskova, who disappeared shortly before embarking for the same region where Konstantin fought. He discovered that she was a seamstress, had brown eyes, and lived a few blocks from the Sokolov family residence before the war. There was no confirmation that the two had been in a relationship, but the similarity to the descriptions in the letters was disturbing. When he showed the name to Konstantin, he remained silent. "Read the document carefully." Then he simply said, "Eva, that name still weighs heavily on my chest, but I don't remember the story, only the pain. It was, or enough." At that moment, Clara understood that some truths could not be reconstructed with documents or testimonies. There were parts of life that dissolve into silence because the heart chose to forget to continue, and yet they remain, like ghosts that do not haunt, but whisper. It was in this process that Clara realized the true meaning of the letters. They weren't just outbursts, not even an attempt to record the horror of war. They were a cry for rescue, a way for Konstantin to stay connected to everything he lost. Each letter was a trace left on the road, in the hope that someone, one day, would find it and follow it. And she followed him. He gathered documents, cross-referenced information, reconstructed possible scenarios. And then, in front of Konstantin, he told the story that he no longer remembered, that of a young man who, before the war, loved a woman named Eva. He was quick to ask her to marry him before boarding. He promised to write it, but never sent any letter, because deep down I didn't write to him. He wrote for what it represented, the last link, to a time when it was still complete. Clara spoke in a choked voice, and he listened as if he were hearing his own story for the first time. "So, she existed?" he asked in a whisper. "Yes, and I think she lived every word you wrote." That day Konstantin didn't say much. He simply remained silent, staring out the window. And for the first time in years, Clara saw tears running down his face, unrestrained. They weren't tears of pain. They were a relief. Because, finally, someone had heard what he had never been able to say. And in that shared silence, something happened. It is not a definitive answer, but a reconciliation between memory and oblivion, between love and absence, between the man who wrote it and the man who survived. The trail of truth was not complete, but now it was possible to walk through it. Clara would stay by his side, not to fill the gaps, but to respect them, because there are silences that say more than any revelation. And when she hugged him goodbye that afternoon, she felt like she was embracing an entire past, and, at the same time, a future that was finally beginning to exist. The letters had revealed a sensitive heart, a poet hidden between trenches and explosions, a man capable of transforming the horror of war into soft declarations of hope. But who, really, was the man behind those words? That was the question that still resonated in Clara's mind, even after so many revelations. He knew Konstantin as the quiet old man of the village, with deep eyes that always seemed to remember something that couldn't be explained. But now, after so much reading, after delving so deeply into his written soul, I wanted to go beyond the surface. I wanted to understand who he became after the words, after the loss, after the silence. Konstantin accepted the curiosity with discreet generosity. There was something about Clara that made him want to remember, even when the memory hurt. She didn't force him, she didn't expose him, she just offered him the space, and he, little by little, filled it. He started telling me small, almost insignificant things, how he liked to drink tea at night, how he taught himself to repair watches, how he collected dry leaves in a notebook. Little by little, the details built an unexpected portrait behind the dramatic and intense words of the letters. There was a man who had learned to live with simplicity and discretion, but this simplicity was the result of difficult decisions. After the war, he said, "I couldn't live among people anymore. They talked too loud. They walked too fast. They expected answers from me that I didn't have." He walked away, isolated himself. He tried the city for a while, but the noises drove him crazy. He tried regular jobs, but none of them made sense. Then he chose the town, the silence, the slow time. And there he built a routine that didn't demand much, but also offered almost nothing except peace. For a while he tried to forget about the letters. He convinced himself that they had only been the outbreak of a moment of pain, but he never threw it away. I couldn't, because deep down he knew those words were the most honest part of who he was. It was there, writing in the midst of clay and gunpowder, where I discovered who I am, he said. I was not the soldier, nor the patriot. I was the man who missed something he never had, but who dreamed as if he had already lost it. Clara listened to everything with almost sacred attention. Sometimes he asked brief questions, other times he simply remained silent, allowing himself to be found among the memories. He realized that Konstantin did not consider himself special. Otherwise, I thought it was normal and boring. But it was precisely this humility that made his story so powerful. He didn't write to impress. I wrote because I needed to, because, without writing, it would have fallen apart. And that, for Clara, was the greatest form of resistance that a human being could demonstrate. One day he brought a tape recorder. He asked permission to record some reports. He agreed, as long as she didn't show it to anyone without his consent. And then, for weeks, they recorded long conversations. He talked about his childhood, the loss of his parents, the first time he saw Eva, the fear of not returning from the war. He talked about his companions, about the improvised burials, about the sleepless nights. But above all, he talked about writing. Writing was like breathing, he once said. But instead of oxygen, I took courage and released everything that was eating me up inside. Clara transcribed every word. He created a digital file, but also a handwritten notebook, as a gesture of affection. And, little by little, he compiled not only a biography, but a testimony. The testimony of a man who won the war, not with weapons, but with words. Over time, he noticed a change in Konstantin. Something in his posture changed. I was more awake. He began to walk more through the garden, smile, more often making tea for two. It was as if, in sharing his story, he also found himself again, no longer as the author of forgotten letters, but as someone worth reading, listening to, and loving. And Clara, with all her sweetness, became the bridge between the man he was and the man he could still be. She didn't see him as a survivor, not even as a veteran. I saw him as the man behind the words, the one who had the courage to love before even knowing love, and that, for her, was everything. "You gave me back to myself," he said one afternoon with moist eyes. "For a long time, I was just a shadow of the words I wrote. Now, I feel like I'm really here." And so, the man behind the words stopped being just a literary memory, and finally became someone complete, someone who dared to love, write, and hope, even without knowing that one day they would finally find it. There are reactions that are born from surprise, others from amazement. But there are also those that sprout slowly, like flowers that were already underground, just waiting for the right heat to bloom. Konstantin's reaction upon rediscovering the words he once wrote was neither explosive nor immediate. It was silent, growing, transformative, because he didn't know what he was waiting for until she showed up. For a long time he lived as if life had already ended. He breathed, he walked, he followed routines, but I didn't expect anything else. I made no plans, I had no hopes. Everything that was vibrant about him seemed to have been left in the trenches, along with the box of letters, along with the past. And then Clara arrived. It did not come like a storm, but like a breeze that, little by little, sweeps away the dust from the old furniture, illuminating what has already been forgotten. And Konstantin, without even knowing it, was prepared. His heart, silenced for decades, still beat strongly. I just needed a reason to remember it. In the first weeks he seemed restrained. He observed Clara, with the delicacy of someone who does not want to frighten the presence that destiny had sent him. He still couldn't understand how that was possible. Someone reading his words, crossing time, finding his hiding place, sitting in front of him and reciting, with genuine emotion, the phrases he wrote in the nights of fear and loneliness. "I can't understand how you found me," he once said. "Or maybe, I wrote to you without even knowing." Clara smiled, with that smile that needs no response. She didn't quite understand it either. I just felt it, and that was enough. Konstantin's reaction was not a revelation, but a transformation. At first, he seemed more attentive, then more present. He began to ask questions, to tell stories in more detail, to remember people, places, old songs. There was a new lightness in his gestures, as if every day with Clara was a rewritten page of a past that he believed to be untouchable. He began to reread his own letters, something I had never done before. Clara encouraged him, but did not insist. They sat together, side by side, with the box between them. Sometimes he read aloud. Others, he simply leafed through, like someone who recognizes his own handwriting but finds the content strange. "I was so young, and so old at the same time," he murmured, holding up one of the pages. "I wrote like I had nothing left, but there was hope in every word, and I didn't even realize it." It was during one of these readings that he finally collapsed. "I was reading a letter written in the middle of winter, describing a woman I imagined wearing a blue scarf, sitting by the window, waiting for a response that never came." When he finished reading, he remained silent for long minutes. Clara respected the moment, but then he looked at her, and there was something new there, something that wasn't just pain. "You are her," he said. "You are the woman I waited for without knowing it." She didn't answer. He just took her hand. In that gesture was the recognition that words cannot be translated, because, deep down, she expected it too, even without knowing it. He hoped to find something, someone, that would give meaning to his sensitivity, so out of time. His mania for loving the old, his inexplicable desire to save what the world has forgotten. And in that moment, the two understood each other completely. Konstantin was no longer just the author of the letters. He was the man who survived time with his heart intact. And Clara was not just the reader, she was the recipient, although unexpectedly. He was the reason behind the words, even if they were written between the lines. Life around him continued. The town remained calm. The world was spinning. But for both of them, everything had changed. Every day, each other's presence healed parts that they didn't even know were hurt. He brought the music to his forgotten record player. He taught her simple recipes that she remembered from childhood. She revived in him the habit of writing. She gave him a new notebook with a hand-embroidered cover and asked him to write in it everything he wanted to forget, because words are sometimes more than memories. They are the way we find to survive ourselves. And so, day after day, without great promises, without oaths, without future plans, only with presence, truth, and shared silence, Konstantin's heart, the one who waited so long without knowing, finally found rest. Loving after pain is like learning a new language. The words don't come easily, the sound seems strange, and there is always the fear of saying something wrong. For Konstantin, love had been a territory known only to the imagination, a space of desire, memory, and idealization. He had rehearsed it in hundreds of letters, but he had never lived it. Not on the outside of the paper, not in the real world. And now there was Clara, sitting in front of you, every day, looking at him not as a hero, nor as a character in his own stories, but like a man. Real, vulnerable, full of silences and hesitation. And he, for the first time in a long time, felt free to learn again. The love that was born between them was not made of promises or oaths. It was woven into small gestures. In the tea he made in the morning, in the way he kept an empty space next to his favorite bench, like someone who no longer wanted to be alone. They didn't talk about love, but he was there, present in every comfortable silence, in every letter reread together, in every painful memory lightly shared. Konstantin rediscovered the words, not the ones he had once written in the trenches, but new words, simple, spontaneous. He asked her how her day had been, told her what she had heard from the neighbors, and read poetry aloud. He laughed at himself when he got an intonation wrong, and she laughed, as if they were both learning to love again, with a new dictionary in hand. One afternoon, Clara arrived with a white envelope. Inside was a letter, the first one who wrote to him. "I don't know if you understand what all this meant to me, but your words found me at a time when I myself was lost. And now, every time I hear your voice, I feel like I'm coming home," he cried. For the first time he received a letter, and it was not a response, nor a return to something he had sent into the world. It was a gift, a confession, an emotional return. And there, on that piece of paper, he discovered what it was like to be loved without having to ask. After that, they began exchanging notes, small, abandoned in unlikely places, under the glass, in the coat pocket, trapped between the pages of old books. Simple words. "The sky is beautiful today. I thought of you, or thank you for smiling with your eyes, or even, I don't know why, but when you arrive, the silence changes color. These small messages created a new ritual. It was no longer just him who wrote. Now, it was a conversation, an exchange, a round trip. And along the way, he realized something profound. True love doesn't need grand gestures. It is based on unsaid words, on details that escape the eyes, but that the heart feels. Konstantin also began to rewrite some of his old letters, not out of regret, but out of necessity. He said he wanted to adapt them to today. That now, with Clara, the old words took on new meanings. Some were read aloud to him, others simply gave it away with a look. And every time he finished reading, the silence between them was like a hug. "You know," he said one night, "writing is what saved me. But it was from you that I learned what it was to be read." And these words moved Clara more than any statement, because it was true. Konstantin always wrote to someone who didn't exist, for a figure built between idealizations, traumas, and longings. But now his words had direction. He had a face, it had a name. Clara, the woman who heard him before she even heard his voice, who read it before knowing it, who recognized him between the lines, and, with patience and affection, taught him that love can also arrive late, but when it arrives with everything that was missing before. Over time, the townspeople began to see changes. Konstantin, who was previously almost invisible, became a living presence in the small routines of the city. He helped in the library, talked to children, wrote letters to those who wanted to learn how to communicate with distant relatives. It became, without realizing it, a connection point between stories, someone who lived to tell the story and who was now, finally, ready to live what he never told. And all this because, one day, he had the courage to write, without knowing who would read it. And because, at some point, a woman decided that those words did not deserve to be forgotten. Learning love again was, for Konstantin, more than an experience. It was a rebirth, not as another man, but as the same man, now complete. For years, Konstantin had built a world with words, a secret universe where his pain found relief, where his desires took shape, where he could love freely, without fear of losing. In that world there was a woman who understood it. He was patient, present, sensitive. She heard him, she responded, even silently. But it was fiction, a shelter created between bombs and rubble. Clara was all that, but live. And there came Konstantin's greatest astonishment, because when he looked at her, sitting in front of him, reading her letters, smiling, crying, gently, touching his arm, he realized that the border between what he wrote and what he lived had disappeared. The woman who before was just a projection was now breathing. He had a voice, it smelled, he had presence, and more. She loved him, not for the soldier he was, nor for the words he wrote, but for who he was. Completely. It was as if the impossible had happened, as if the letters, thrown into the void, had found an echo in time. They were not only read, but felt. They didn't just touch each other, they woke up. "Sometimes I wonder if I wrote to call you," he said one afternoon. "Or maybe I read you before I met you," Clara replied. It was a mutual confession, the recognition that, somehow, their souls had already crossed paths before their bodies met. Fiction gave way to reality with an almost terrifying naturalness. What Konstantin described in his letters, the gestures, the glances, the dreamed meetings now happened effortlessly. I had once written about the image of a woman, leaning against the window, reading quietly. And now, every morning, Clara sat at the window of his house, with a book in her hands, exactly as he had imagined decades ago. "It seems like you've always been here," he said, with a mixture of charm and disbelief. Clara felt the same. As absurd as it seemed, there was a kind of deep recognition between the two, as if the texts had anticipated the feelings, as if dreams, so carefully written, had shaped reality itself. And yet, there was something new, the surprise of living, because fiction, no matter how beautiful it is always predictable. You are under the control of the author, but reality surprises. Pronunciation errors appear, the unexpected touch, the untimely laughter, the silence that requires no explanation, the tiredness, the smell of burnt coffee, the sound of rain falling as two people share an old blanket. None of that was in the cards, but all of this became part of the new story they were writing together. Konstantin learned that true love is not made of perfect words alone. It is made of presence, to share, of new beginnings. And no matter how much he rehearsed this feeling in his letters, now it was different. It was more intense, more real, more fragile, and therefore more valuable. One night, while Clara slept next to him, with her head resting on his shoulder, he watched her for long minutes. The light of the lamp danced across his face, and he felt a peace he had never known. There was no longer paper, no ink, no metaphors. There was skin, breathing, heat, and, in his heart, a feeling that mixed gratitude, amazement, and reverence. If someone had told me I would one day experience this, I would have called it a fantasy, he whispered. But now I understand that some fantasies just wait for time to become memories, and the memory, now, was vivid. They began to record the days, not with long texts, but with short sentences in a shared diary. Each one wrote something in the morning, a thought, a question, a feeling. At night they read together. It was a new type of letter, no more for someone absent, but between two gifts. In one of these records Clara wrote, "You taught me that words can cross the distance, but you also taught me that shared silence is where love grows the most." Fiction had become reality, but not as a substitute. It was a development. What Konstantin wrote during the war was not an illusion, it was an omen. It was as if love already existed, and Clara was the name he finally found. It wasn't magic, it wasn't a miracle. It was destiny, woven with words, sewn with time, sealed with truth. And now, as they wrote together the new phase of this story, they knew what seemed too dreamy to be lived was exactly what they were living. It was there, in Konstantin's ancient hands, a simple sheet, folded with the same care as before. Beige paper, slightly stained edges, but firm and clear handwriting. Clara looked at him with teary eyes. He knew what that leaf represented. It was the last one, the last in a series of letters that began in the chaos of war and now ended in peace. But at the same time, it was also the beginning of something new, something that has never been written before, a shared history. That morning he had asked for some time alone. He sat down at the rustic wooden table, placed a cup of tea next to it, and opened the old pen case. He chose a blue one, the same one he wore when he was still young. He took a deep breath, and he started writing, like it was your first text message, as if all along the way there had been a rehearsal for that moment. "Clara," he began, "today I no longer write to an unknown woman, not even to an idealized face in my tired mind. I write to you, to the one who came, to the one who stayed, to the one who read everything I saved, even without knowing if it was worth it." The words flowed more naturally than I expected. There was no rush, fearless, no filter, simply true. A serene and mature truth, born of coexistence and delicacy. He wrote about how she made him believe in time again, about how, for once, he wanted the days to be long. Let the clock tick slowly, because every second with her was a gift that no war could erase. You are the answer that time took to give me. And now that you have arrived, I no longer need to write to endure your absence. I write to celebrate your presence. When he finished, he folded the letter as he always did, but this time he put it in an envelope, and he sealed it with a gesture that was more symbolic than practical. An old stamp, with no postal value, only to mark the end of a cycle. He walked to the living room where Clara was waiting for him, with a book on her lap and a half-full cup. He handed her the envelope without saying anything. He sat next to her and waited. Clara read in silence. Each line was like a warm breath in the heart. It was more than a statement. It was a new beginning, an invitation to something that did not yet have a name, but that already lived in both of them. When he finished, he placed the letter against his chest and said, almost in a whisper, "This is the first letter I have received that makes me feel complete." That's when he smiled. Not a broad smile, but that kind of expression that is only seen on those who have freed themselves from something very old. Because Konstantin had finally said goodbye to his absence. The woman he wrote to for so many years was no longer a symbol or a solitary hope. He had a face. He was tactful. He had a voice. This letter, although titled as the last, did not contain a story. He opened another, a story that would not be written only on pages of paper, but in mornings shared, in slow walks through the streets of the town, in simple meals with slow conversations, in silences that do not require explanation. From that day, they decided to start a new notebook, no longer with individual letters, but with notes from both. A Diary of Us, a book written by 4 hands. In it, they would record not only memories, but also plans. Yes, plans. Something Konstantin hadn't done since before the war. And now, with Clara, he was planning little things: a new flower for the garden, an autumn walk, a rainy day under the blanket, an old recipe to cook together. And so he learned again how to build the future. Not the idealized future of his letters, but a real, possible, and shared one. "You taught me," he said, "that you don't need to erase the past to live in the present. You just need to have someone to share it with." And Clara responded with the simplicity of someone who knows that true love is not built with great gestures, but with continuity. "Now we write together, and that's enough." The last letter was kept in a special envelope and placed in the same wooden box where all the others slept. But instead of closing it with the old padlock, they decided to leave it open, as if to say, there is still room for more, there is still a lot to live, there are still stories to write and feel. There were no fireworks or celebrations that night, just 2 hearts, at peace, breathing together at the same rhythm, and a silent promise, sealed not with ink but with presence. The love that began between words now lived between gestures, and what was once a diary of loneliness finally became a story of 2. Some loves are born from looks exchanged in youth, others from unexpected encounters in the middle of life. But there are also those that appear much earlier, before eyes meet, before hands touch, even before the right moment arrives. They are loves that, for some unknown reason, were already written, recorded in silence, as if they had been designed by a greater and patient force, who knows exactly when lives must intersect. This was the love of Konstantin and Clara. It didn't happen suddenly, or with screams. It didn't come with promises or urgency. It came slowly, like someone who walks for a long time and only then recognizes the place where it always belonged. He wrote letters to a woman he never met. She read these letters and, as she read them, she found herself. What started as fiction became destiny, and what seemed improbable became true. Konstantin was no longer the young man tormented by the war, lost between trenches and goodbyes. Nor was he just the lonely old man living in seclusion in a forgotten town. Now, he was the man who survived time, losses, his own memory, and found, in Clara's eyes, the answer to everything he didn't know he was asking. She, in turn, discovered that love does not need logic, that there are connections that span decades, distances, silences, that the sensitivity that always made her feel out of place was, in fact, the map that would lead her to him. The love between them was made of words and pauses, of resigned memories. Pain is cured with simple gestures. It was a mature love, although newborn, a love that didn't need to prove itself, just be. Together they began to reconstruct time. Konstantin, who for so long wrote to endure absence, now wrote to record his presence. Every day with Clara was a chapter that I wanted to preserve, and she, with her natural delicacy, encouraged him to continue, not as a writer of letters to the wind, but as a chronicler of a true story. "It is no longer necessary to write to be remembered," he said. "Now you are alive." The letterbox, once a symbol of loneliness, became a kind of reliquary of faith. Clara organized the pages in rough order, covered them carefully, and together they created an index, not with exact dates, but with titles that described feelings: Letter of Hope, Fear Night, Faceless Confession, Longing for Someone Yet to Come. It was a way to shape the trajectory that led them to that point, a way to understand that destiny did not fail, it just took time. The people, who had observed Konstantin's silence for so long, now saw him smile, and smile together. He became the man of stories, of beautiful words, of slow advice. Clara organized reading meetings in the library and read her letters to young people who, until then, believed that deep feelings only existed in books. And they discovered, with him, that sometimes real life is more poetic than any fiction. One day, while they were watching the sunset, Clara asked, "Can you believe this was all already written?" Konstantin was slow to respond. Then, with his gaze fixed on the horizon, he said, "I believe that what is written in destiny is not what will happen, but what cannot stop happening. We find ourselves, even if it takes time, even if we get lost, even if it seems impossible." She simply rested her head on his shoulder, and there they remained, in silence, as the day slowly died. His silence was no longer empty, it was full. It was filled with everything they had experienced, everything they wrote down, everything they finally understood. The love that once lived between the lines now had a home. I lived in both, and more than that, he inspired others. Clara decided to publish part of the letters with Konstantin's permission, not out of vanity, but out of mission. I wanted the world to know what words can cross time, that hopes never grow old, that love is not limited to youth, and that, sometimes, life waits for us to mature and then offers us what we always wanted. The book owes its name to a phrase written in the last letter, "Now I know you." Simple, deep, true. Konstantin lived his last years with a peace he had never imagined, and when he finally left, he did so lightly, as someone who accomplished everything he needed to accomplish, like someone who no longer owed anything to time, like someone who knew that love, once truly lived, never dies. Clara stayed. He kept the box, the shared notebook, the letters, but above all, he maintained the feeling, because the love written by destiny does not end, it simply changes shape. It becomes longing, it becomes a legacy, it becomes a living memory in those who continue to love. And now, when he writes, and he writes, he knows exactly who for. And you know that, somewhere beyond time, someone is reading. If you have come this far, it is because this story touched you in some way. Share with us, do you believe that destiny can unite people separated by time? Leave it in the comments. I believe in love, written by destiny. Let's create together a space for stories that deserve to be remembered. And if this video moved you, give it a like, subscribe and activate the bell. Every week, new stories that show that love lasts, even when everything seems lost.